I never thought a cream-colored envelope could detonate my life like a landmine. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, tacked with a single piece of Scotch tape to the faded green front door of my grandmother's Victorian farmhouse. There was no knock, no doorbell, just the whisper of quiet audacity, flapping in the breeze like a taunt. The lettering was embossed in gold foil, the kind you'd expect from high-end wedding planners or trust fund brats trying to play Gatsby. My name wasn't on it. Instead, the invitation announced in elegant serif the wedding of Rebecca Lynn Thornton and James Allen Caldwell. Location Foster Gardens, Willowbrook. My coffee, still steaming in my hand, suddenly tasted cold and bitter. I reread the address. It was my house, my backyard, the place where I had spent the last 6 months sweating, bleeding, and rebuilding my grandmother's legacy, now rebranded by strangers as a venue for love and lace. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake, some idiotic mail merge error. But no, this was intentional, deliberate. I turned the envelope over and saw a printed insert with parking instructions and a contact number for vendor deliveries or urgent queries. My name absent. My permission never asked. The name Foster Gardens stung, like hearing a friend's voice coming out of a stranger's mouth. It wasn't just the audacity, it was the familiarity, the entitlement layered into every word. My house, the one my grandmother Eleanor Foster had spent her life protecting from exactly this kind of invasion, was being used as a backdrop for a wedding I hadn't even been invited to. A quick scroll on my phone confirmed the nightmare. There it was, my house listed on a glossy wedding venue website under Willowbrook Heritage Properties, complete with photos of my backyard, recent photos, taken after I'd moved in. They'd used images of the garden I was still in the middle of restoring. My stomach knotted. I called the number on the card. It rang 5 times before someone picked up Rebecca. The bride, her voice was all performative sweetness, syrupy and brittle. "Oh, you must be calling about the parking," she chirped. "Don't worry, the guests are parking on Maple Lane, so your driveway won't be blocked." I paused, breathed, spoke carefully, evenly. "No. Miss Thornton, I'm calling because you've scheduled your wedding on my private property without my permission." The silence that followed was thick. She returned with a clipped, offended tone, "Sharon, that's ridiculous. I've already paid the venue fee to the Willowbrook Heritage Association. Everything's arranged. The Foster Gardens is a registered historic site." My voice turned to ice. "It is not. I live here. I own it. And I have never, not once, authorized any events. Take it up with Cynthia Morgan." She snapped. "She's the HOA president." She said everything was cleared. Then she hung up. Just like that. My first reaction wasn't anger. It was something worse, an icy disbelief. Like the rules of the world had quietly shifted while I was sleeping. It wasn't just disrespect. It was a hostile rewriting of reality. My home had been hijacked by a wedding I didn't know existed, and no one thought to tell me. It was as if I didn't exist. I pulled out the folder my grandmother had kept in the study deeds, property lines, letters from the city. Sure enough, her house had always sat outside the Willowbrook HOA lines. She had chosen this land specifically to avoid meddling neighbors and power-hungry committees. She called the HOA a polite form of tyranny. I threw on a jacket and drove straight to the HOA office. A receptionist with a corporate smile told me Cynthia was very busy with the spring planning committee. I didn't care. I insisted. Within 10 minutes, I was ushered into a beige conference room where Cynthia Morgan sat at the head of a long table, surrounded by minions with clipboards and Botoxed faces. She looked up, offered a smile that never touched her eyes, and said, "Mr. Foster, what seems to be the issue?" I laid the invitation on the table. "The issue," I said, "is that you're advertising my property as a wedding venue without permission, collecting fees, and allowing strangers to plan events on my land." A man slid a document toward me. I picked it up and felt a cold dread unfurl in my spine. It was a property use agreement, signed 3 months before my grandmother died. But the signature wasn't hers. It was a weak imitation. Shaky, exaggerated. A cartoon of her real handwriting. "This is forged," I said, holding the paper like it was radioactive. My grandmother was in hospice. She couldn't even hold a pen, let alone sign this. Cynthia didn't blink. "The agreement is binding." 2 board members witnessed it. The site has already been booked. Backing out now could incur damages. There is no site. I said, there's my house. That's it. And no one gets married there without my consent. One of the board members, a woman in pearls and a smug smile, piped up, the program helps preserve community heritage. The funds go toward upkeep. What funds, I asked. I've received $0, not a penny. Uneasy looks passed between the board members. Cynthia cleared her throat. There's a reserve fund. We were going to approach you once things settled. How many weddings, I asked. Just 3 this season, the woman said quickly. Yours is the premier venue. I laughed, a dry sound like wind through dead leaves. This is fraud. This is trespassing, and I'm shutting it down. As I stood to leave, Cynthia called out behind me, Mr. Foster, I advise you not to make this difficult. This community has powerful allies. You'd be wise to cooperate. I turned, met her eyes. Bah, is that a threat? Her smile thinned. Just a fact. Her words echoed in my ears all the way home. That's when the full scope of it hit me. This wasn't about a wedding. This was a land grab, a power move. My 5-acre property was the last green space not swallowed up by HOA regulations. My grandmother had always feared this. And now it was happening disguised as romance, masked in peonies and Pinterest dreams. They hadn't just tried to steal my yard. They tried to rewrite history. And if they thought I'd just let it happen, if they believed I was too isolated, too polite, or too weak to fight back, they were about to learn something very unpleasant about the man they'd mistaken for a pushover. Because I was done talking. I was done being polite. And I had just begun to plan what would become the most poetic act of lawful, unforgettable revenge this town had ever seen. The morning after my confrontation at the HOA office, the fog that blanketed Willowbrook felt thicker than usual, like the air itself was holding its breath. I sat on the porch of the house I had grown up visiting every summer, coffee steaming in my hand, staring at the iron garden gate my grandmother once painted a soft blue. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt right. The house had always been my sanctuary, a place of memory, rootedness, and inherited strength. Now it felt violated. Not by fire or theft, but by something more insidious assumption. Entitlement, a quiet rewriting of ownership by people who had never walked this soil barefoot, never weeded these rose beds with aching knees, never watched the golden light of late spring filter through the ancient oaks. I checked my inbox. Nothing yet from James Harrington, our family attorney, but I knew he'd be preparing something forceful. Still, legal letters wouldn't undo the damage that had already been done, the strangers who had walked this land with cameras, the advertisements online that sold my inheritance like a party rental, the voices who had already decided I didn't matter. That was the part I couldn't stomach. Not the wedding, not even the forged contract. It was the silence, the confidence that I wouldn't push back, that my consent was optional, a formality. I needed information more than just the polished lie Cynthia had offered in that sterile conference room. If my grandmother had truly signed nothing, and if they were bold enough to fake her signature, then how far had they taken this scam? Who else had been misled? I drove to the county registrar's office, a squat gray building that smelled like dust and bureaucratic regret. I requested all public filings related to my property from the past 2 years. The clerk raised an eyebrow at the date range but said nothing. A half hour later, I had a folder thick with paper permits filed under false pretenses, HOA meeting minutes referencing heritage preservation, and a particularly troubling note, an application to submit the Foster property for local landmark designation, initiated by the HOA, citing community stewardship as justification. I laughed under my breath. Community stewardship, as if they had pruned a single branch or picked up a single piece of litter. Worse yet, the file included expense reports, payments made to a landscaping company I had never hired, fees for pest control, flower shipments, tent rentals. They'd been preparing this property for months. Invoices were paid from an HOA subaccount labeled event maintenance. Cynthia hadn't just rented out my land. She had manufactured a whole ecosystem around it, financial, administrative, and aesthetic. She was running a ghost venue, using someone else's legacy. And judging by the consistency of the bookings, it was lucrative. That afternoon, I returned to my house with a new sense of gravity. It wasn't just me versus a bridezilla or a neighborhood busybody. It was me versus a system, one built on soft power, plausible deniability, and small-town allegiances. I sat at the old piano in the parlor of my grandmother's. I hadn't touched it in years. I let my fingers rest on the keys. I didn't play. Not yet. I just let the silence sit with me, the way she used to do when she was thinking. She never rushed a decision. She always listened to the quiet. And in that quiet, I remembered something, the key. Not metaphorically a literal key, hidden in the back of the china cabinet, taped behind a drawer. She had shown it to me once when I was 13. "This is for the lockbox," she'd whispered. "If anything ever happens to me, or if they ever come for the house, that's where you look." At the time, I had no idea what she meant, but now it made sense. I opened the cabinet, pulled out the drawer, and found it still there, an old brass key wrapped in a strip of floral ribbon. The lockbox was in the attic, covered in dust, tucked behind suitcases and brittle wreaths made of dried lavender. Inside, I found everything: letters she had written to the town council, copies of rejected buyout offers from Willowbrook Estates, a signed affidavit stating her refusal to join the HOA, and a personal letter addressed to me. "Michael," it began, in her elegant, looping script. "If you're reading this, something has gone terribly wrong, and I'm sorry, but I never wanted you to inherit a battle, but I also knew you were the only one who could win it. These people, Cynthia Morgan and her circle, they will not stop. They speak of community, but they mean control. They dress it in roses and bylaws, but it's always been about power. They want this land because it is the last thing they don't own. You must not give it to them, not for money, not for convenience, not even for peace. They will press. They will threaten. But remember, this house was built before them. And if you stand, it will outlast them. Trust your instincts. Fight for the truth. And if you must be louder than their lies." I read the letter 3 times. Then I folded it and placed it in my pocket. The next step was riskier. I needed to speak to someone from the inside, not Cynthia, someone who had seen things, someone with doubts. And I knew just the name: Sharon Peterson, the boutique owner with the overly bright smile who had sat to Cynthia's right during the meeting, nodding like a bobblehead. She'd looked unsure even then. The kind of woman who played along, not because she agreed, but because she feared the fallout. I found her in her shop that evening. It was empty except for the faint smell of rose perfume and the quiet tick of a vintage clock. She blinked when she saw me. "Mr. Foster, is everything all right?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply asked, "Did you know the signature was forged?" Her breath caught. That was enough. "I didn't see the original document," she whispered. "Cynthia brought it to a closed meeting, said it had been approved. She showed us a photocopy. It didn't feel right." "But you said nothing," I replied. She looked ashamed. I didn't know what to do. Cynthia said the board would be liable if we backed out, and the bookings had already started. There was money involved, a lot of it. We were told it was temporary, that no one would get hurt. I showed her the photos, the invoice list, the permit filings. Her face turned pale. "This isn't just bad judgment." I said, "This is a scheme, and you're part of it, unless you help me stop it." She didn't speak for a long time. Then she reached under the counter and pulled out a folder. "These are the financial records Cynthia never submitted to the full board. I wasn't supposed to keep copies, but I did. Something didn't sit right. Maybe it's time someone else sees them." I thanked her and left. By the time I got home, it was dark. I sat down in my grandmother's old armchair, leafing through numbers, dates, transfers. And what I saw confirmed everything. Almost $50,000 in bookings had been funneled through what Cynthia called an administrative escrow, but less than 10% had ever gone toward the supposed property upkeep. The rest used for community improvement, staff incentives, and most egregiously an HOA board retreat in Napa Valley. They'd used my home as a piggy bank, and now I had the proof. Still, I knew Cynthia wouldn't go quietly. She had built her kingdom on perception, neat hedges, clean sidewalks, and the illusion of benevolence. The only way to tear it down was to shatter that illusion, not just in court, in public, in front of the very people she used to hide behind. It wasn't revenge I wanted, it was reckoning. And it would begin with a Saturday no one in Willowbrook would ever forget. Saturday morning arrived dressed in gold, the kind of early summer brilliance that made everything seem brighter than it really was. But under that sheen of sunlight, I was staging a war. Not a violent one, not even a loud one, but one meticulously choreographed to make a point so unmistakable, so public, so irreversible, that Cynthia Morgan and her paper kingdom of fraudulent influence would finally collapse beneath its own arrogance. At precisely 7:30 a.m., the legal limit for noise in our town, 3 trucks rolled up my gravel driveway in perfect formation. First came the portable toilet company, bright blue stalls lined up like sentinels along the front lawn, positioned where the garden path used to welcome guests with lavender and lilies. Next, a pest control firm that I'd hired specifically for their high visibility signage. Their crew encircled the perimeter with bold yellow hazard flags and active treatment, do not enter warnings staked into the flower beds. Last, and most beautiful of all, was the demolition company. Not to destroy anything, but to look like they might. A compact bulldozer, parked neatly behind the wraparound porch, engine humming like a promise. I wasn't going to touch the gazebo, but no one else knew that. I wore a work vest and carried a clipboard, walking the grounds with deliberate purpose, jotting imaginary notes as if I were planning a topographical reimagination of Versailles. I'd warned the immediate neighbors a day earlier. Most had rolled their eyes with sympathy. A few had offered beer. One old man gave me a knowing nod and simply said, "'Bout damn time." Cynthia Morgan, of course, showed up 37 minutes later in a silver Mercedes, hair lacquered into obedience, face frozen in a veneer of Pilates confidence and HOA supremacy. She stepped out of the car like she was descending from Mount Olympus to survey the barbarian uprising. "What the hell is going on here?" she snapped, heels sinking into the lawn with every livid step. I smiled with an ease that was entirely performative. "Good morning, Cynthia. Landscape improvements? New drainage lines? Fresh grading? Possibly a koi pond?" I motioned to the bulldozer, which gleamed in the morning light. "Starting Monday, but we're staging equipment early to beat the rush." Her eyes narrowed. "The Thornton Caldwell wedding is next weekend. You know that." I said, tilting my head, feigning ignorance. "That event which was scheduled here without my consent." "Yes, I suppose this does interfere. How unfortunate." As if on cue, a white BMW screeched to a halt behind Cynthia's car. Rebecca Thornton emerged in pastel panic, phone clutched like a lifeline, eyes scanning the toilets, signs, the bulldozer, and finally, me. "What is this?" she demanded. I approached gently, tone calm but firm. "Miss Thornton, I'm very sorry that you're caught in this mess, but you should know that your venue was never legally secured. My grandmother's signature was forged on the agreement. I've filed legal action. Cynthia had no authority to offer my home." Rebecca's face blanched, her mascara darkening beneath her eyes as her voice cracked. "But I paid $8,000. Invitations were sent, the caterers, the rentals. Everything's designed around this place," I nodded. "And I understand. Which is why I took the liberty of contacting the Willow Creek Lodge earlier this week. They had a cancellation. I told them about your situation. They're willing to host your wedding. In fact, they're offering a discount because they're as fed up with Cynthia's behavior as I am." For a moment, Rebecca just stared at me, as if the words didn't compute. Then she slowly turned to Cynthia. "You said the owner agreed. You told me the family honored all prior bookings." Cynthia's smile had vanished. Her voice was brittle glass. "Rebecca, darling, there's been a minor misunderstanding. Nothing that can't be worked out. You lied to me," Rebecca said, "to all of us. My parents, my planner, we trusted you." More cars arrived. Rebecca's mother, her wedding planner, a couple of friends. They stood at the edges of the lawn like horrified wedding guests who'd shown up a week early to find the bride sobbing and the venue covered in biohazard signs. Whispers turned into murmurs. Phones came out. Pictures were taken. I made no effort to stop them. The point was to be seen, but public humiliation was Cynthia's kryptonite. Her power thrived in whispers, in tidy emails, in passive-aggressive newsletters. This circus was her unraveling, and I wasn't done. I spotted James Caldwell, the groom, walking toward the case in a tailored suit and the expression of a man who just watched his future catch fire. I motioned him aside. "I want to be clear," I said, keeping my voice low. This fight is with Cynthia and the HOA, not with you or Rebecca. I don't want your wedding ruined. That's why I arranged an alternate venue. He blinked, incredulous. You did that? I nodded. Because someone had to, and because I believe in making the guilty pay, not the innocent. He glanced at his fiancée, who was now arguing openly with Cynthia in full view of the wedding planner and several recording phones. Jesus, he muttered. This is getting to be all over town. Good, I said. That's the idea. He looked at me for a long moment, then held out his hand. You just earned yourself a friend, Mr. Foster. I shook it, and you just earned a better wedding. Across the lawn, Rebecca screamed, 200 guests. Cynthia, from out of state. Where the hell are they supposed to go? Your backyard, Cynthia flinched at the suggestion. Her own house, though perfectly manicured, couldn't accommodate a party of 15, let alone a garden ceremony with a string quartet and hand-blown champagne flutes. As the argument devolved into open bickering, I stepped back. Let it burn. Let the whole rotten edifice collapse in front of an audience. Because what followed was magic. The wedding planner began yelling about contracts. Rebecca's mother demanded refunds. Onlookers gathered. A few HOA members from neighboring houses appeared at the fence line, mouths agape. Walter Jenkins showed up just in time to see Cynthia backpedaling through a tangle of apologies, half-truths, and unraveling lies. He sipped from a coffee cup and gave me a thumbs up like we were watching a 4th of July parade. And still, I wasn't finished. I pulled out my phone and opened the HOA financial records Sharon Peterson had slipped me. One by one, I handed printed copies to the vendors, the family members, even the wedding planner. You may want to know, I said loudly enough for the crowd to hear, that the booking fees, almost 50 grand, never went to the homeowners. Less than 10% was ever used for upkeep. The rest funded the HOA clubhouse renovation, board retreats, and one very extravagant dinner at Le Petit Jardin. The gasps were audible. Phones snapped more photos. And just like that, the dominoes fell. Cynthia's control disintegrated not with a bang, but with a flurry of text messages and hastily muttered denials. She climbed back into her Mercedes, jaw tight, fury boiling beneath her surface like lava under glass. The next morning, the story hit local social media. By noon, a local paper had picked it up. Wedding war exposes HOA corruption. The headline read, with images, oh, glorious images of bright blue portable toilets lined up like toy soldiers on my lawn. Cynthia's mouth mid-scream, and a bulldozer looming in the background like Chekhov's gun. That night, I got a call from James Harrington, my lawyer. You've done it, he said, half laughing, half in awe. The HOA board has placed Cynthia on leave pending investigation. City council's distancing themselves. And the best part, your property is officially exempt from all HOA jurisdiction. I didn't say anything, just looked out at the lawn, now quiet again. The signs being taken down, the equipment rolled away. A war had ended, not in court, but on the battlefield of public opinion. Cynthia's empire wasn't just bruised, it was dismantled. Not with lawsuits, with sunlight, with exposure. With the simple, unstoppable truth, by Sunday afternoon, the dust had not yet settled, but the winds were already shifting. It started small, like all tremors before a collapse do. A cautious knock on my door at 3:17 p.m. broke the soft rhythm of birdsong and the hum of bees around the overgrown rose arbor. When I opened it, Sharon Peterson stood there, not in her usual boutique perfect blazer and pearls, but in jeans, flats, and an expression that hovered between shame and resolve. I stepped aside, saying nothing. She entered quietly and stood at the center of the parlor, the place where my grandmother's piano still kept its silent watch. Mr. Foster, she said. Michael, I owe you an apology. I offered her the same chair where Walter had sat only days before, and as she sank into it, she looked older, somehow less composed, more real. I thought Cynthia was just overreaching. She said slowly, I thought the documents were strange, yes. But I never imagined she'd go as far as forging your grandmother's name. I handed her the letter, the one my grandmother had left me in the lockbox. Sharon read it in silence, her fingers trembling slightly. When she finished, she handed it back and looked out the window, her voice quieter. Eleanor was the soul of this neighborhood. She told us no more than once, and we should have respected that. But Cynthia, she made it sound like a technicality. Said your grandmother had a change of heart. I believed her. You wanted to believe her, I said, because it was easier than questioning everything you were a part of. Sharon nodded. The HOA board met last night. Emergency session. Without Cynthia. That caught my attention. I leaned forward, and she's suspended indefinitely. Sharon said, we've opened an investigation, a formal one, not just internal. The financials are damning. Several members have already resigned. I did too. I studied her for a moment. She didn't look like someone trying to save face. She looked like someone tired of pretending. There's talk, she added, of criminal charges, forgery, misappropriation of funds, breach of fiduciary duty. Her husband's under scrutiny now. 2, he pushed the zoning request to get your land reevaluated last year. Quietly, through a subcommittee, and the others I asked. The people who just nodded along, Sharon took a breath. Some of them were fooled. Some just didn't care. But most of them were scared. Cynthia had this way of implying consequences without saying anything outright. Vendor contracts would disappear, property assessments would spike, city inspections would show up unannounced. People didn't fight because they knew she'd make them regret it, until someone did. I said, Sharon smiled, but there was sorrow in it, until you did. That week, a parade of reluctant pilgrims made their way up my driveway, former board members, residents, even business owners who had once benefited from Cynthia's referrals. They arrived awkwardly, some with coffee or wine or gift baskets like peace offerings, and they all said the same thing, in slightly different ways. We should have known. I'm sorry. She told us you'd agreed. We didn't ask enough questions. I didn't absolve them. I didn't need to. The public shame was penance enough. Word spread fast in a town like Willowbrook, and Cynthia Morgan, once queen of manicured lawns and artisan newsletter fonts, found herself isolated with astonishing speed. Vendors canceled future deals. Her real estate license was frozen pending ethics review. Her social circle crumbled. Her Mercedes was seen parked for hours at the town attorney's office. The last time I saw her, she was standing in front of her house with a realtor, pointing out hedges and windows with a kind of detached professionalism that betrayed no emotion. But her eyes, when they met mine, were no longer cold. They were hollow. She didn't wave. I didn't either. And that was enough. The HOA was restructured within 2 weeks. A new interim president was voted in, Angela, a middle school teacher who wore floral skirts and had lived on Maple Lane for 20 years without once attending a single board dinner. Her first order of business was to dismantle the Heritage Property Initiative entirely. No more unsolicited listings, no more forced participation. The funds remaining in the event maintenance account were returned. Every dollar traceable went back to the defrauded couples and vendors. And just like that, the machine stopped. Not with a dramatic explosion, but with a sequence of quiet, deliberate disassemblies. Rebecca and James got married that Saturday at Willow Creek Lodge. The venue turned out to be spectacular in a different way, tucked between rolling hills and a small lake that shimmered like glass under the afternoon sun. They sent me a thank you card a week later. A photograph was included, the two of them under a white trellis, smiling, not a trace of the prior chaos on their faces. Thank you for saving our wedding, the card read, and for exposing the truth. It ended up being a much better story this way. I kept it on the mantle, beside my grandmother's photo and a framed map of the original Foster property lines. I wasn't naive. I knew the story would eventually fade, people would stop talking. The next HOA board would move on to streetlight policies and dog park debates. But the precedent was set. The idea that someone could stand up to small-town tyranny and not just survive but win was now part of the narrative. More importantly, the land was safe. No one could touch it without my consent. No one could rent it, rename it, or reimagine it into something I didn't choose. And slowly, the house started to feel like home again. I repainted the gazebo, cleared the pathways, planted fresh roses from cuttings Walter Jenkins had saved in a greenhouse he kept out of town. He came by often, mostly to work, but sometimes to sit and drink coffee under the same oak tree that once shaded my grandmother. One morning, as we planted a new row of heritage blooms near the west fence, he said, I think she knew all along that this would happen, that they'd come for it, but she didn't fight them herself. No, I said, she left that to me. He nodded, jamming the spade into the soil. And you did it your way. Quiet when you had to be. Loud when it mattered. She taught me that. Walter chuckled. She taught us all something. That summer, I hosted a small garden party, not a wedding. Just neighbors, music, food, laughter, no permits, no board approval. Just people gathering in a space meant to be shared on our terms. Angela showed up with a pie. Sharon brought her grown daughter. Even some of the old guard came by, sheepishly sipping lemonade and pretending they had always been on the right side of the story. And for once, I let it go, because some victories are louder in silence. That night, under the fairy lights strung through oak branches and the soft hum of music drifting across the lawn, I looked around and felt something click back into place. Not just the house or the garden, but the story. The one my grandmother started, the one I now carried forward. Not just with defiance, but with stewardship and dignity, and a memory that refused to be rewritten. A year passed, not in silence, but in growth. The kind of growth that doesn't scream for attention, but speaks in roots and branches, in new blooms where decay once lingered. The Foster property was no longer a battleground, it was a sanctuary again. The air smelled different now, cleaner, touched by the soft perfume of reborn roses and tilled earth. The house had regained its voice. Wooden floors no longer creaked with tension but with age, like an elder stretching its joints. And every crevice, every shadow, had been swept of the lies that once tried to inhabit it. The gazebo, freshly painted in a shade just slightly paler than the original, stood proudly again at the garden center, surrounded by a full circle of Eleanor Foster's legacy roses grown from Walter Jenkins's preserved cuttings, soil rebalanced, trellises reinforced. The transformation hadn't come overnight. It had arrived slowly, like healing tends to, one small repair at a time, one decision to stay and rebuild instead of flee. There were no more HOA letters in my mailbox. No more unsolicited flyers slipped under the door. No more shadowy photographers treating my home like a set piece for someone else's fantasy. The silence from the HOA had become a kind of respect, or perhaps fear. Either worked for me. Cynthia Morgan and her husband had left Willowbrook in late fall. Their estate sold quietly to a retired couple from Boston who asked no questions about the previous owners. I had watched their moving truck pull away through the slits of the old wooden blinds in the front parlor. No one stood outside to wave. No one brought cookies. No one mourned their departure. Cynthia received a 2-year probation sentence for fraud and forgery and was banned from holding leadership in any civic organization for 5 years. Her husband lost his seat on the city council a few months later in an election that felt more like a cleansing than a vote. I didn't smile when I heard the news. I didn't need to. Some victories are quieter than gloating. Some are best felt in the tilt of the sunlight on a newly painted porch, or the rustle of spring leaves in a garden no longer shadowed by trespass. But perhaps the most unexpected chapter came not from justice or revenge, but from gratitude. One afternoon in early March, as the first tulip shoots peeked from the soil like timid dancers, a package arrived. No sender name, just an ivory envelope tucked inside with a familiar looping script. Rebecca Caldwell. Inside was a bottle of expensive champagne, the kind that sparkled like liquid gold under kitchen lights, and a folded note that simply read, "You saved more than a wedding." You reminded us what it means to own our stories. Willow Creek was beautiful, but it wouldn't have been possible without your kindness in the face of chaos. You turned our disaster into a memory worth keeping. I placed the bottle on the mantel, next to the framed photo she'd sent months before. I wasn't sentimental, not usually, but there was something about that image, two people who'd unknowingly walked into a storm and emerged intact, that struck me as emblematic of what this place had become. Not just resilient, redemptive. In June, I hosted another garden party. This time it wasn't spontaneous or whispered among neighbors. It was open, deliberate. Invitations were sent. No RSVP required. Just an invitation to gather. To witness the full return of Foster Gardens, not as a rental property, not as a backdrop, but as a living, breathing testament to boundaries, legacy, and the quiet strength of saying no. People came, dozens of them. Former adversaries, new families, longtime locals who remembered Eleanor as the woman with the impossible roses. Children played tag beneath the oaks. Someone brought a guitar. The lights I strung between the branches twinkled against the deepening summer dusk, like stars that had forgotten they didn't belong to Earth. Walter was there, of course. He stood with a glass of sweet tea, his hands still bearing the dirt from an afternoon of pruning, and watched it all unfold with the same patient pride he once wore while teaching me to graft vines. "She'd be proud, he said, nodding toward the house, now bathed in amber light. "Not just of the garden, but of how you held the line." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. We both knew what had been fought for, what had been protected, what had been reclaimed. Later that evening, I wandered the paths alone as the guests began to trickle out, the music fading into laughter and hushed goodbyes. My shoes crunched against newly laid gravel. The air was warm with jasmine and memory. I paused at the edge of the garden where the original fence still stood, now reinforced and hand-painted. A small engraved plaque rested in the grass nearby. Just a few words etched into weather-resistant steel: Eleanor Foster's garden, preserved by choice, not by force. I hadn't told anyone I'd ordered it. It wasn't for show, it was for grounding, a reminder that not everything sacred has to be enshrined in law or locked behind permits. Sometimes the greatest protection is simply standing firm. The next morning, as sunlight spilled across the windows and painted the parlor in gold, I brewed coffee and sat on the porch with a notebook. No to-do list, no zoning maps, just sketches, possibilities, a rose arbor shaped like a spiral. A water feature made from old stones Eleanor once collected from creek beds, perhaps even a bench inscribed with a quote she used to whisper while tending her garden. "Nothing that grows is ever really alone." I didn't know what the next year would bring. Maybe another challenge, maybe peace. But I knew one thing for certain: whatever happened next would happen on my terms. If someone wanted to hold a wedding in this garden, they'd knock, they'd ask. And if I said yes, it would be because the story felt right, because the roots ran deep enough, and because, at last, this place had been returned not just to me, but to what it was always meant to be. Not a product, not a venue, but a legacy, alive, blooming, chosen.